I'll introduce our both speakers very briefly. Jason Falinski, the former MP for Mackellar, currently working for the economic modelling firm Ergo Videtur. Is that bad for someone who failed Latin and a Latin failure? Yeah. And Michael Sexton, SC, lawyer of course, and author. Michael's spoken about his books here before. But for tonight, the topic is, we're going to lead off with Michael, we'll go to Jason, then we'll come to questions and discussion. And the topic is, has the Liberal Party lost its traditional base? Two views, and the first view from Michael and the second view from Jason. And off we go.
How's that? Thanks, Gerard. Has the Liberal Party lost its traditional base? Well, there's a sense, of course, in which both major parties have lost their traditional base. In the 1950s and the 1960s, although it's something of a simplification, the working classes largely voted Labor and the middle classes Liberal. For those first 2 decades of the post-war years, the Liberals enjoyed unbroken power, albeit in part at least because the political cycle had been disrupted by the Labor split in 1955. There are still classes in Australia, but they're more varied and fluid than they were in that earlier period, not least because of the huge impact of immigration on Australian society over the whole period of the post-war years. While I'm going tonight to focus on what I see to be some of the particular problems the Liberals have in 2024, I'm not suggesting that they cannot or will not win elections in the immediate future. Although they're currently out of office in 7 of the 9 Australian polities, the remaining 2 being Tasmania, where they hold office precariously by way of a minority government, and the Northern Territory after last Saturday's election. Country Liberal Party, of course, there. Moreover, in 5 of those other 7 jurisdictions, the parliamentary margin is such that it would make it very difficult to win the next election. To this, one must add the fact that the Liberals need to gain an absolute majority in those lower houses, because otherwise Labor would almost certainly be able to form government with the support of the Greens and any independents. It's also true that even when in government, the Liberals face severe difficulties in implementing their policies because they do not have a majority in the Senate or in the 5 state upper houses. Same is true for Labor, of course, given that neither of the major parties has been able to obtain such a majority in recent times. But Labor is normally able to rely on the Greens and independents to enact their legislative proposals, albeit often after considerable negotiation with those groups. One obvious exception perhaps to all this is Queensland, where it appears very likely the coalition will take office in October and there's no upper house. It might be noted, however, that the notion of time for a change has a lot of force in Queensland, where Labor has held office for almost 30 of the last 35 years. The first problem for Liberals that I'd point to is that they're no longer the party of the establishment, as they were at least up until the 1970s. Or to put another way, there's a different establishment and it's largely hostile to the Liberals. Up until the 1970s, the establishment broadly included the corporate sector, the Protestant churches, the medical and legal professions, senior public servants, the ABC, and university administrators and academics. These groups largely supported the Liberal Party, but starting in the 1980s, many public and private institutions in Australia were captured by different forces that subscribed to new doctrines of political correctness. Those forces were largely unsympathetic to the Liberal Party, given the tenor of the doctrines they hold, which included the portrayal of Australian society as essentially racist, hostility to the resources industry in the context of climate policy, antipathy to all forms of the Christian religion, transference of power from parliaments to courts by way of a Bill of Rights, advocacy of open borders without any restrictions on unauthorised immigration, suspicion of the activities of law enforcement bodies, and governance by international bodies such as the UN when they disagreed with an Australian government. Looking at some of the institutions that comprise the new establishment, the Australian print media is largely supportive of the policies of Labor and the Greens, particularly the ABC, but also the 9 newspapers, including the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age. Even more hostile are the Guardian, the Saturday Paper, the Monthly, Quarterly Essay, Crikey, New Matilda and the New Daily. There are alternative views in the News Corp publications and on Sky Television, but there's a degree of diversity in the political opinions of the commentators employed by those publications. It might be assumed that most members of the general community do not take the same obsessive interest in politics as the Canberra Press Gallery, but their exposure over what is now a lengthy period of time to a coverage of political events that is heavily adverse to the Liberals does raise the question of what impact this might have over the longer term. In the case of universities, most academic and administrative staff share a politically correct agenda that is unsympathetic to the Liberals. American studies of the politics of college professors have found Democrat supporters outnumber Republican adherents by a ratio of over 10 to 1. And I suspect that the political breakdown of university staff in Australia would be very unfavourable to the Liberals. The notion of a university as a place where all questions can be openly debated has little role now in Australian academia. In 2018, for example, Sydney University rejected a proposal by the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation to initiate a course on this subject. The rejection came after a group of its academics engaged in a public protest. They issued a statement claiming that the only people who invoke Western civilisation in anything other than a critical spirit are members of the racist right, adding that Western civilisation is a favourite umbrella term sheltering all manner of toxic and paranoid prejudices. Those students who do not share the views of most of their lecturers would know that public contradiction of those views would be likely to endanger their academic progress rather significantly. The various curriculums governing teaching in schools now reflect a high degree of political correctness, particularly in the areas of history and literature, so that as in universities, students who might hold contrary views would know that to express them would be very likely to endanger their academic grades. It might be expected that the welfare sector, exemplified by its peak body, the Australian Council of Social Services, is essentially part of Labor's constituency. But in their establishment days, the Liberals were strongly supported by the corporate sector in the form of both big and small business. This is still true to some extent in the case of small businesses, but many of the boards of major public corporations have embraced the doctrines of political correctness, perhaps out of genuine enthusiasm, or perhaps also to seek the approval of the new establishment. This attitude is reflected in a degree of caution about political donations to the Liberals. The union movement, on the other hand, provides active support for Labor, whether in government or in opposition, and donates very large sums for election campaigns. It might be noted that at recent federal elections, peak business organisations have been largely silent, seemingly unwilling to risk offending what may be an incoming Labor government. In relation to the cultural world, literature, music, film, arts, there is a high degree of political correctness and very little support for the Liberals. In the case, for example, of literary festivals, which there are quite a number now in Australia, There's seldom any disagreement amongst the speakers on political and social questions, where a politically correct consensus is the norm. As it happens, there seems little appetite in the audience at these festivals to have these views challenged, but they can be confident that their opinions will only be reinforced by those on the stage. The second problem that I'd particularly identified for the Liberals is the voting intentions of young voters, that is, those between the ages of 18 and 34, as reflected in recent polls. If one takes, for example, a news poll published in The Australian on the 8th of July of this year, we observe that the primary vote support for the two major parties and the Greens was as follows: Labor 30%, Coalition 27%, Greens 27%. It might be said that the Labor vote is only slightly ahead of the Coalition vote, but it can be assumed that Labor and the Greens will essentially exchange preferences. One factor in these figures is no doubt the climate in universities that has already been referred to, given the number of persons in Australia now taking some form of tertiary education. Another factor is that voters in this age group have never known any form of economic recession, and no doubt assume that economic growth can never falter. It's easy and correct, as it happens, to say that the Greens' economic policies are totally irrational and impractical, but that does not stop them having some appeal where they have the apparent attraction of simplicity and equity. The third problem that I'd point to is that the Liberals' traditional reputation for responsible economic management has lost much of its electoral attraction. It's extraordinary to recall in the 1950s, Gerard and I are old enough to remember this, that Menzies made great political capital during election campaigns out of Labor's rather modest spending proposals, often directed to apparently worthy areas like aged pensions, asking rhetorically, where is the money coming from? Such a question would cut little ice today, when increased government expenditure is seen by much of the electorate as the solution to any particular social or economic problem in society. At the same time, community groups jostle for increased funding in their own areas, indifferent to the overall budgetary position. The nexus between expenditure and revenue is never really addressed and has led to the disproportionate reliance for tax revenue on salary and wages in contrast to other, more efficient forms of taxation. There is no real notion of the allocation of scarce resources in the discussion of bond budgets. In these circumstances, it's difficult for the Liberals to stake out a different and a more rational position on economic policy from Labor and the Greens without the risk of alienating at least some of the numerous and very vocal interest groups that are vying for government funding. These groups are capable of generating media storms if they feel that they've been shortchanged in relation to grants of funds. Must also be said that Liberal governments in recent times, particularly at the federal level, have presided over ever-increasing government expenditure in a wide range of areas, so that in the community's mind, there's really no point of differentiation in this area. Similarly, in relation to government regulation of various sectors of the economy and society generally, the federal Liberal government 2013 to 2022 was just as enthusiastic as Labor in government in areas of regulation, even in such once unlikely fields as sport and charities. Well, all this may sound very pessimistic for the immediate future of the Liberals, but as I suggested at the outset, there are no guarantees in politics, as last Saturday in the Northern Territory demonstrated. But I would say that these structural problems do pose some real difficulties for the Liberals in the short and medium term, and that's really reflected in their position in most of the parliaments around the country at the federal, state and the territorial level. I would not, however, make any dogmatic predictions. These are almost always a mistake in any discussion of future political events. I'll pass it on to Jason.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much, my good friends. Thank you for coming to hear me tonight. Given that I could not convince my mother to attend, I will assume that you are all here to listen to Michael. Michael, thank you for agreeing to share a stage with me. You have provided a welcome amount of intellectual rigour and gravitas to this evening. Thank you also to Gerard, not only for inviting me to speak this evening, but for all your unending contribution to the Australian public square. You have ensured that public discourse has remained more attached to reason and fact than it otherwise would have over many decades. It is not just your glasses that give you the aspect of an owl, but rather your unrivalled ability to peer into the darkness of human foible and irrationality to find fundamental truth. We would be a lesser place for your absence. And to Anne, I've often wondered if it be a mere coincidence that Athena's favourite animal was that of an owl, but it seems fitting that the Greek goddess of wisdom should choose so wisely. And it is entirely fitting that you should choose such a seemingly simple yet revealing topic for this evening. For a political movement that is uncertain of who it represents, has no idea of what to fight for, much less what to stand for, is doomed to failure. And as the saying goes, he who stands for nothing falls for everything. The reason that we keep losing unlosable elections and failing to win winnable ones is because there is no clear sense of what and who we should be standing up for. If 90% of any cure is diagnosis, then whomever conceived of this question this evening was endowed with considerable wisdom. There are two schools of thought. The first is promoted by very influential and well-known personalities within the Conservative movement, that we need to move further to the right. The second school of thought is propounded by people like Matt Keane and Dominic Perrottet, that we need to move left, especially on issues like climate change, female emancipation, and bureaucratic decision-making on many matters, often given the misnomer of integrity. With respect to both schools, I do not believe that either argument stands up to scrutiny. The first school claims that there are 1 million votes in right-wing fringe parties that would otherwise vote for the Liberal Party. On any reading of the electoral mathematics, this is simply not true. At the height of even liberally defined right-wing fringe parties, only just slightly more than 700,000 people voted for them in 2013, when my good friend and widely believed to be conservative, Tony Abbott, was leader of the Liberal Party. This fell in every election until 2022, when slightly just over 500,000 people voted for these right-wing fringe parties. The second fact is that many of these votes, rather than being distributed evenly across the Australian the Australian continent, are concentrated in exactly the wrong places for the Liberal Party to win seats. So they are mostly concentrated in regional and rural Queensland and New South Wales. So instead of turning 2% marginal seats into 2% Liberal seats, they would tend to turn 20% Liberal seats into 25% Liberal seats. The other question is, would any of these votes come back to the Liberal Party? The fact is it was Lyndon Crosby in 1998 who realised that people voting for One Nation were overwhelmingly previously long-term Labor Party voters, and that they were using One Nation as a bridge from the Labor Party to the Liberal Party. And from that point, so was born the so-called Queensland strategy for the Howard government. The second school inherits a problem that the first also has. What exactly would we say that would leverage these voters from these parties where they already are? Indeed, all the historical and international evidence is that if you adopt the policies of your opponent, it tends to reinforce your opponent's arguments rather than diminish them. It tends to drive more votes into their column rather than into yours. So in a strange way, by adopting their policies, you're actually cementing their position and costing yourself votes. James Carville once famously said, if Pepsi decided to call itself Coca-Cola, I'm not going to suddenly become a Pepsi drinker, I'm just going to drink more Coke. It is my contention that our base is right where we left them. We do not need to go searching for a new constituency, rather we need to return from whence we came. I'd like to illustrate this using what is called an issues values map. The horizontal axis is the traditional left-right axis, and it is mostly called the economic axis. At one end you have what would be called libertarian economics, followed by free market economics, followed by technocratic, bureaucratic, command and control, and finally state ownership on the far left. I personally think that this axis should be renamed the value axis because economics is actually about values, not finance, which is how it is often seen in the Australian context. The vertical axis is the cultural axis, with post-materialist and materialist voters, post-materialists at the top, post-materialists at the bottom. This has recently been supplanted by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have luxury voters at the top, aspirational voters in the middle, and needs-based voters at the bottom. Absent population skewing, this graph is normally distributed, that is 97.5% of the population is within half the distance of the intersection of the axes. There are as many people to the left as to the right and below as above the axis. There are some obvious observations from this graph. The first is that the Liberal Party is the only party organised around the economic axis. If you were to see one of these maps in real, they look like a scattergram with some very sometimes odd observations where you might find Labor voters in the top right-hand corner for some reason. But what you have there in my badly drawn shapes is where you find concentration of votes. So you will find 90% of Liberal votes within that graph, Labor votes, etc. There are a lot of political resources. There are a lot of political resources in the top left-hand corner, which is why the left can sustain so many parties. Because of compulsory preferential voting, there is little cost to this arrangement and benefits in niche marketing and also a false idea that there is actually contest of ideas in that quadrant. So when the consideration curve is tilted, that is the curve on which people are generally thinking about issues, whether they're cultural or economic issues, when it is tilted towards the cultural issues, non-Liberal parties benefit. When it is tilted towards economic issues, the Liberal Party benefits disproportionately. There are no parties to the right of the cultural curve other than the Liberal Party. Allow me to apply the last two federal elections to this framework. In 2019, we, being the Liberal Party, should not have won, but the franking credits campaign led by Tim Wilson tilted the consideration curve to the economic axis, which opened other economic issues and allowed us to win an improbable victory. While this was seen at the time and since as the result of a superior campaign by us, I would strongly contend that we actually got in our own way over and over again during that campaign and actually set up substantive problems for us in 2022. In 2022, due to the COVID crisis that we had the opposite effect. We had significant population skewing. There are a number of statistics that I can use to demonstrate this, but my favourite one is this. At the start of 2020, household savings was $77 billion. By the start of 2022, they were $355 billion. By the time of the May 22 election, people were working less, earning more, and had never been worth more. Aspirational voters have become luxury voters, needs-based voters have become aspirational voters, and luxury voters cease to exist on this plane of existence. Further, the consideration plane was now aligned basically entirely with the cultural axis. Economic issues were not in anyone's consideration. To put this in stark relief, over 2 election cycles, in the seat of Wentworth, the Liberal Party lost 25% of its primary vote, whereas in the seat of Lindsay, we had a 7% swing to us. In most of Western Sydney, the Liberal Party enjoyed swings of between 7 and 9%. Self-evidently, when the Liberal Party is framing issues in terms of economic or values-based decisions, we win. When we are involving ourselves in cultural debates, they win. In the words of Tony Abbott, when climate change is a moral issue, we lose. When it is an economics issue, and I would add engineering issue, we win. There are 4 famous frameworks which I think we should all consider tonight, as well as this one. There's the Menzies Forgotten People framework. At the core of that was a framework that essentially said the Liberal Party would represent the disempowered, the people without a voice, the disorganised. And while, as Michael has eloquently put, that group of people has significantly changed, it still represents a vast majority of the Australian electorate. The other one is the Abbott critique, where Tony makes the point that in most postmodern societies, there are 3 classes: the working class, the welfare class, which are not just people who receive money from Centrelink, but include for people who rely predominantly on income from the government. So, for example, all of the partners at PwC. And of course, the bossy class, who of course can always enjoy the support of the welfare class. The Trump alliance. This was a lot more obvious before, while it was Trump v Biden, but there appears to be in the Western world 2 groups. And when I say this, I don't mean everyone over 65 was voting for Joe Biden, but he was outperforming amongst Gen X women and voters aged over 65. Trump was outperforming, particularly amongst men under 50 and men particularly under 35. He was outperforming amongst minority, amongst working class, and amongst ethnic groups as well. This is not something that we're just seeing amongst Trump voters. In Canada, Pierre Poilievre is currently leading by 25 points amongst young Canadians and is against Justin Trudeau, and is currently in front of Trudeau's party by 35 points overall. And Harvey Millet, who has the benefit of me actually being able to pronounce his last name as opposed to Pierre, won almost 70% of young Argentinian votes. Ron DeSantis's victory in Florida, his largest voting group was men under the age of 35. And if you cut it up by men under 35, under 30, under 25, it was consistent. He won that group 27 to 32%. The final one, which I think is my favourite, is the Reagan coalition. Ronald Reagan said that most Americans are not interested in whether the Republican Party is going to the left or to the right. They want a political party that has the policies and proposals to make their lives easier, that gives them, their children and their communities more hope and more opportunities. The question for the Republican Party is not whether to go left or right, but whether we want this great country to go up or down. This is not just an archaic debate for diehards. On this rests the success and survival of liberty in our public square. If we fail to get this right, to understand clearly what is worth fighting for and then fighting for it, then the candle of freedom will surely be snuffed out. But I do not come here tonight to bemoan the encroaching darkness. I came here tonight to beseech as many of you who are interested and able to engage in this great debate so that that candle might burn brightly yet. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both our speakers. So we come to question time and discussion time. So Michael, there's a question. Anne? Michael?
Just getting a mic.
Okay. No need to stand up. Okay.
Thanks.
You come back here.
Thanks so much. Interesting perspectives. I'm just wondering to what extent you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs in particular, and we seem to have local councils focused on the self-actualisation but not fixing potholes and things like that. My question is, to what extent...
The lead on the thing.
To what extent are we finding that the Liberals, with their traditional idea of creating conditions that enable individuals to succeed or to be successful, is being overtaken by Labor telling individuals that they can address the collective and help the collective, as opposed to letting individuals get on and create their own lives, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Come up the centre.
Well, I think I mentioned in the talk that one of the problems that the Liberals have, I think, is the idea prevalent in Australia, in the electorate, that government is the solution to all problems. Very different society from the United States, for example, and so that makes it hard for them to frame policies in a sense that differentiate from Labor and the Greens because of the problem of that view in the electorate. I don't see that changing in the immediate future. I think they have to try and maintain a line of sound economic management and hope that will penetrate to some extent into the electorate. A lot of that depends, of course, on economic circumstances. As I say, if you were to have some difficult economic times, then that sort of approach is likely to resonate much more powerfully. But just as we stand at the moment, that seems to me to be one of the medium-term problems that the Liberals have.
So I think that you're right. I think I humbly disagree with Michael. I think the difference between Australia and the United States is that right-wing parties in the United States make the case for freedom, make the case for individual empowerment, make the case for governments not being the solution to the problem, government actually being the problem. And there is plenty of evidence in Australia for that being the fact. And so I think where you get to the issue is we just need to go out there and tell the story. And for people who think that that will take a long time to bite or to resonate or to make a difference, I just point to Pierre Poilievre in Canada, who in a very short period of time has taken a party that was consistently always behind the Justin Trudeau's party and is now 30 points in front and going further in front by simply stating a truth that we know to be obvious.
Thank you. Thank you both for your comments. I'm sure others have said it, but I believe John Howard said that politics is a battle of ideas. Margaret Thatcher considered one of her greatest successes being Tony Blair. Bill Clinton's great success was, Ronald Reagan's great success was Bill Clinton. In the battle of ideas is not necessarily won in elections. It's about convincing your opponents. And it seems to me that for quite a while, the Liberal Party has been losing. They may have won elections, but they've been losing the battle of ideas consistently. Michael described it quite well. The schools, the institutions, the battle has been, if it's not over, it's a losing battle. My question is, you both have been describing how to win elections. I haven't heard why people should vote for the Liberal Party.
Well, that's a different question to what I was asked to answer tonight. Athena thought of a much better and wiser question than that one. My answer to you is I disagree with John Howard. Politics isn't a battle of ideas, it's a battle of stories and explanatory stories. And we are very bad at telling stories, and the left is very good at telling stories. I also further disagree with all the institutions that you and Michael listed are all taxpayer-funded institutions. They don't serve anyone in the Australian community but themselves. And the minute the Liberal Party is in government, it has the opportunity to stop funding these institutions. And then what happens to the left and all of its infrastructure? It is a very fragile movement based on smoke and mirrors. In terms of why you should vote for the Liberal Party, it's pretty simple. Do you want you to have your decision about what the best life is for you, or do you want some bureaucrat in Canberra to make that decision for you?
Well, I just said that not all the institutions that I'm speaking about are publicly funded. The boards of many large public corporations now have adopted views of political correctness that would put them seriously at odds with in many cases, with the Liberal Party. But if I just go back to the question that was asked, I think I suggested, that in many ways the Liberals have, so far at any rate, perhaps not for good, but so far have lost the culture wars. and that seems to me to be one of their problems. But I'm not suggesting, of course, that they adopt. It's not for me to suggest anything, perhaps, to them, but I'm not suggesting academically that they adopt the views of their opponents, because that would be, of course, completely counterproductive. But the task is really to try and put those alternative views across to the community in a more attractive way, I think, than has been done to date. It's not easy. Not easy when, as I say, most of the powerful and influential sections of society are dominated now by their opponents. But there isn't a choice if they're going to continue as a major political party.
I guess if I can answer that, I mean, the reason that corporations or corporate boards adopt this woke agenda, for the lack of a better term, is because under government regulation, we give 12.5% of our wages every year to industry super, and they control a vast majority of these boards through their proxy advisors. So industry super funds, of which there are 26, I think, Nick, they own one proxy advisor who then holds all their votes. So you might sit there and say, oh, Australian Super only owns 3% of CBA, add up all the shares owned by industry super, and very quickly it gets to 26, 27%. Now, once again, that can be changed. That can be changed very easily if the federal government wants to. John Howard could have changed that anytime he wanted to between 2004 and 2007. If we actually include our income tax rates, along with the sort of social security allowance we have the highest tax rates in the world, cutting in at the lowest tax rate possible. I mean, when was the last time you heard a Liberal politician make that point?
Just go back to Michael's comment. Just come up, Michael. I mean, I agree completely with your analysis. I'd like to get Jason's comment on this too. I agree completely with your analysis, and yet I look back and I think that even in recent times, the Coalition's won more elections than Labor's won. So how does the theory match what happens on election day? Not all of the time, but most of the time in recent years.
If you just look at the current situation in the parliaments around Australia, I mean, I'd use that as some evidence for my thesis. But if, there is, of course, with all governments, a period of decline, and governments can't last forever. We're about to probably see that in Queensland, where it's almost lasted forever. So to some extent, with compulsory voting, then the thesis that the Liberals have significant problems, I mean, there will be periods when they can win elections. I'm not suggesting that they can't, they won't, that they haven't. But I'm just saying, if you look at as we stand today, that there are some very serious structural problems, and that's reflected really if you look across the parliaments around Australia.
Look, I think, Gerard, you've made a good point, but I think, we've been in government federally for 18 of the last 25 years. I think the problem for the Canberra Press Gallery is that they refuse to let the facts get in the way of a good story. And the facts at the moment are that Peter Dutton will become the next Prime Minister of Australia. Now, that may be inconvenient for them. And by the way, every published poll that comes out shows that is increasingly becoming the case. So, I think that we can bemoan the ABC and all sorts of other things, but the capacity for Liberals and Conservatives to get their message out has never been greater than it is today. If the media, in inverted commas, has always been left wing, has always taken a progressive line on things, and there was nothing Liberals and Conservatives could do about that. At the moment, if Channel 9 News runs a story, like 10 years ago, 1 million people saw it. Now it's like about 100,000. And I can probably counter that with a good post on X. So the ability to get out ideas has never been greater than it is at the moment. We just need to develop those stories that resonate with people in a manner and form that makes a difference.
With the climate science and the engineering problems associated with it, why is the Liberals left essentially the ownership of that to the left?
I agree. So to the earlier question, which is, I would also say where one of our great failures is we haven't engaged on intractable problems because we thought there weren't votes in it. So Indigenous Australians is just a classic example. Our justice system is a classic example. The misuse of the legal system for profit over justice is a classic example. The Liberal Party runs away from actually engaging seriously in those debates because we think it costs us votes. But we actually have, when we apply our values to those problems, good ideas. And that's why we should do it. And we're seeing that at the moment with Peter Dutton talking about nuclear energy, which is a situation where he's actually proposing an alternative idea, an idea that the IEA supports, an idea that Bill Gates supports, an idea that 19 out of OECD countries support. And so I think that demonstrates that at least we're having a debate, and it's a debate that people are warming up to.
I'll be brief. Interested to hear, as Jason noted on that lovely slide, the value, which has been removed, the values of teal voters tend to fall in a different sort of quadrant or space to other voters. Interested to hear what you guys propose to do to win them back.
Oh.
Well, fortunately, it's not my job to have to win back the teals. In some senses, the teals represent a kind of a natural development of the fact that, and this came to some extent out of what Jason was the points that Jason was making, that in terms of classes in Australia, in as much as they still exist in different ways, that affluence is now, in many ways, a sign of Labor voting, and even in some cases Green voting. And that's really what the development of the teals represents as well. So that that's what makes them difficult to deal with, because they are an affluent group within their voters, or an affluent group within the community, and they can afford to vote for parties that, on the face of it, once would have represented quite contrary interests.
I should put out before Jason speaks. Jason's a former Liberal member for Mackellar. Michael's here as a scribbler, a commentator, an author, and someone who's doing analysis. He's not here for any particular group. Jason.
So I'm the discredited one. Thank you, Gerard. Look, I think your question proceeds on a false premise, which is that teal voters were previously Liberal voters. They weren't. So it's not a matter of winning them back. It's a matter of winning those people who have traditionally voted Liberal, who at that election decided for various reasons, and I can bore you to death what those reasons are, to give the teals a go. I think that what we need to do is what I was saying. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but the very nice looking man in the green shirt, very distinguished looking, probably the best question of this evening. Which is his point, which is I think the Liberal Party needs to engage in these debates and in these issues, even where there are not votes, because we need to demonstrate that we care about everyone. So I think one of the problems with the Howard Doctrine was that Crosby Textor said, just focus on your core equity, which was economic management. And what that meant was we gave up area of policy interest after area of policy interest after area of policy interest. And the result of which was that we were just left with economic management. I think we need to re-engage on all those areas. I'd also make a further point, which Tony Abbott made, which was we were in government, but we weren't in power. And one of the reasons for that was that, once again, Crosby Textor's playbook was become a small target, offend no one, you get elected. The truth is that we saw in the United Kingdom with David Cameron, the one policy area that they were the two policy areas they were able to make significant shifts on were firstly in reducing debt and retiring spending in the government, which he made a central plank of his election campaign. And the second one was in education, where Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings did excellent work when they were in opposition. So when they came to government, despite the fact that the bureaucracy and all the interest groups that Michael are referring to tried to stop them, they were able to get through because they won the argument in opposition. If you do that, if you explain to people the benefits of what you're doing, you end up getting your policy through. Margaret Thatcher showed that with privatisation. That was not a policy, that was not a positive policy, and frankly, the reason that Australia got it right was we learnt from so many of the mistakes that she made. But by doing it, she was actually able to demonstrate that most of these functions are best left in the hands of people who are closer to the customers and the people they're meant to be serving.
Thank you for taking my questions. I'd like to ask both speakers, given what happened to UK, the recent election, what is your opinion? Like like in UK, the Conservative Party lost like a defeat and a landslide defeat. What is the possibility for Australian Liberal, for the next election? Could they also end up like the UK Conservative Party?
Well, if you want my view, I think that at the next federal election, which will be within the next 6 or 8 months, that the government will lose some seats, that they will be forced into some sort of minority government with Greens and Independents, which will be extremely unsatisfactory. I don't think that Liberals would be able to get back in one go at this coming election. It's interesting that the different trends, for example, that I talked about young people and voting. The British, same sort of trend as in Australia in terms of young people not being prepared to vote for conservative parties, whereas to some extent in the US and in other countries, Canada for example, a number of European countries, you've got quite the reverse trend. So this would be interesting to analyse. I haven't done it, but I just noticed these differences in different parts of the West at the moment.
Voters don't think, they feel. So there's a lot of evolutionary psychology involved in politics, and the one thing that we cannot cope with is incompetence. So when you think about us existing in tribes on the Savannah Plain, the head of the tribe couldn't be incompetent. Essentially, Rishi Sunak, lost because Liz Truss's government was just such a disaster, and they never recovered from there. I mean, they had an economic breakdown, the like of which we've never seen in Australia. They had a situation where, pension funds were having to liquidate positions in order to get cash. I mean, it was a disaster scenario, frankly, and they never recovered from that point forward, and people wanted to get rid of them. The other thing that we've seen is right-wing governments during COVID adopted left-wing authoritarian policies for good reasons. They spent too much money, they locked people down. The left loved it, the right hated it. Right-wing governments coming out of COVID have really copped it in the neck, unless you're Ron DeSantis, who basically said, old people stay at home, the rest of you go nuts. And the issue for that was that they were always going to find it tough in that environment to stay in power. But once again, to Michael's point, I mean, they lost everywhere, but amongst young men, they actually got to 50-50, the Conservative Party. We are seeing amongst younger males, starting from about under 50, but accelerating to under 35, a major swing away from left-wing parties. I'm not saying towards right-wing parties, but away from left-wing parties.
I've got a Zoom question here from someone in Gunnedah who says, I found both your analysis very interesting, but how did they stack up against what happened in The Voice? Is there any relevance to what your analysis is?
The Voice is an interesting case because all of the institutions, of course, that I referred to were overwhelmingly in favour of it, and yet it was decisively rejected by the electorate. I think even despite the very one-sided campaign that was run very much in favour of the Voice, I think somehow the electorate perceived that this was that there was a real problem about this proposal, in a way which it divided the community into different groups. One could say that historically referendums in Australia have almost entirely been lost, but I'm not sure that's the full explanation. It's a good question because it does tend to cut across some of the things that I've said. But I can only say that I think that on this occasion, despite all the background noise, that the Australian electorate actually picked up the key point in that proposal.
So in using the map, the proposal started off as a very cultural issue about promoting people who were clearly poverty-stricken and had not had opportunities that they otherwise had or should have had in a modern Australian society, and it was driven along a cultural issue of identity. As time went on, though, that consideration curve switched back to the value curve, and the thing that drives all of us across the entire spectrum is a sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves. Some people call it tribalism, other people call it a hive mentality. This proposal directly threatened that idea. It was threatening to divide the tribe, and once that value proposition came into consideration in people's thinking about it, that's when you saw it drop or sink like a stone.
This is a simple one about the next election. Michael Kroger in the last week has worked out from the polls with very scientific, proper use of the measurements that he calculates the Liberal Nationals will win 72 seats at the next election and the Labor Party 64. Now, should that sort of scenario happen, as a former Liberal member, Jason, would you recommend that the Liberals go into government as a minority from opposition? Or would it be better for them to just let it ride?
So that's really interesting analysis by Michael. So I suppose he's saying at the moment that's what he thinks the result would be. Look, I think if you project forward, I keep saying, like facts don't lie, good stories can, and the facts tell one story. Peter Dutton will be the next Prime Minister, and the Canberra Press Gallery just can't seem to get its head around that. And I think when it does, and it's going to do its usual trick of come the day after the election go, oh, no one saw this coming, But the fact of the matter remains that that would be a really interesting outcome, because there is no way that the Greens would support the Liberal Party. And the Greens will probably have 5 to 6 seats. So if they're at 62, did you say, or 64?
64, but there are a lot of independents.
Well,
that might go with a majority. I mean, I would think it would be foolish for them to do it.
Yeah.
But would they be tempted to?
I don't think it'll be an option. I think the Teals and the Greens you can count on, but the Teals will almost all certainly back Labor. I mean, Monique Ryan and Kate Chaney were members of the Labor Party 5 minutes before they arrived as community independents. Everyone I've spoken to who knows Zoe Daniels tells me she's dark green. Zali Steggall didn't vote for Mike Baird in 2011. So when 60% of the New South Wales community was voting Liberal, she didn't vote for the most moderate of Liberals in Mount. So if anyone who says that, anyway, and I think, Sophie Scomps is pretty dark green as well. I mean, that's why she was supporting the Greens on Hamas and other things. So yeah, I think that would be a dream outcome for the Liberal Party if it can't form a majority government.
I think I mentioned that one of the problems for the Liberals is that they really need to get almost an absolute majority in their own right in any lower house, because Greens, Teals, Independents will almost all support Labor. So that's a tall order, and that strikes me as the problem for the Liberals at the next federal election. They may do extremely well. It's hard to say at this. I think it's too early to say at this stage, but whatever the result, I think it'd be very difficult for them to form a government.
I think that's a great. We've come to time. That's a great spot on which to end. So just thank you very much. So we've had one very brave prediction, Jason, and one moderate analysis with Michael. But I thought they were both terrific papers, which will last a long time, and they're both very thoughtful, well put together, different, but both quite compelling in each in their own way. And they'll make terrific papers in the Sydney papers, and as this goes out on TV and videos and wherever else, and on our audios as well. So for tonight, well done. We'd love to have you back after the election. Okay.